Blech. Here's the thing, though, and this is important to note. Howie was not stoked about this article when it came out. Howie saw that Legs posted this on Facebook and was not pleased and felt that things were taken out of context. I could see why. Like, these are really just sort of like pastiches of various stories. Howie Pyro says, I mean, most people's musical tastes at 14 years old aren't that well developed, but I saw the Dictators when I was 14 at my junior high school in Whitestone, Queens, where I grew up. It was sort of by chance that I saw the Dictators. You know, it just came about, but I had never really heard of them before, nor had anyone. It was their third gig, and their first two gigs were like opening for like REO Speedwagon and someone else, and both gigs were really bad, where they were booed off the stage. It's worth noting that the Dictators, when Legs was sort of like coining the term punk, the Dictators and the Ramones were the bands he was thinking of. The Dictators, the stuff that they were writing about in their songs, sort of, you know, helped to sort of classify this counterculture music that was really happening, because there was no like formula or sound. It was just, it was more of a scene. Punk rock was more of a scene than it was a sound, you know, and that's why all the bands, you have so many bands that sounded so different because of that. And the Dictators gig at my junior high school, this was their first absolutely great experience. They brought 1 million bags of White Castle. Yeah, they loved White Castle. They love White Castle from the Bronx. And they just pummeled the audience with White Castle hamburgers. That would be great. The entire show. Man, I wish I'd asked Andy about that. It became like a giant food fight. It was all young kids my age, and it was just the greatest thing ever. They were amazing. It was my first like extreme experience. You know what I mean? My only other experience was my guitar teacher, and this is also really weird. I had a guitar teacher, and his name was Mike Pardow, and he lived nearby, and my dad would drop me off for my guitar lessons in Queens, and he had bands. He was around from before, and he had hung out with the New York Dolls at the Mercer Art Center before. So in like 72, I think, I'm not sure if it was in 71, but in 72, the Mercer Art Center was the place to be. It's no longer around. It was torn down, but that was like where the New York Dolls would hold kind of like residencies there. You know, they would play there often. That's where the New York Dolls kind of like rose up, as well as Max's Kansas City. And he said, so he was around for that, for the Mercer Art Center and all that stuff. As a matter of fact, what was that HBO show that like kind of details like punk? It was on for 2 seasons, and they show the Mercer Arts. They show the New York Dolls playing in the Mercer Art Center, and it's very dramatized. The ceiling crumbles as they're playing Personality Crisis. So he was into all that stuff, and I was like, wow, wow, wow. And he had old pictures of him, and he used to look like David Bowie, and he was like the freak of the neighborhood. So he was just the guitar teacher, and he smoked Salem's, which is how I started smoking Salem's, which is what you smoke, Legs. Legs note, used to smoke. Mike Pardow was really cool, and he wasn't going to make me play, you know, Row, Row, Row Your Boat. We were immediately to Vicious by Lou Reed. Vicious, you hit me with the flower. Great, great song off of the album Transformer by Lou Reed, although I am partial to Berlin. But you really have to be in a good mindset to listen to Berlin, because you will like want to kind of die. I was terrible in high school, even though I was very smart. I couldn't handle it. I just got into this program. This is another good story, actually. It all leads to it's really funny. I've never even put these 3 stories together, actually. I was put in this program where you go to school a week and you work a week. It was like a program for bad kids, kind of, you know. I got a job on Wall Street packing boxes or something. They get you a job. So I was like going to the city, which is what Manhattan is called if you're from Queens or Brooklyn or Long Island. I was going to the city for a whole week at a time to go to this job. It was really cool. I met my black counterpart, and there was another kid who was my age who lived in the Bronx. And I was telling him about punk rock. This was really, really early in punk rock. Like maybe Television single came out on Orc Records. So that might be 1973, 1974. Okay, never mind. I'm corrected. I'm looking at the next paragraph. He says this was already late 1975, like maybe into 1976. And my black counterpart was telling me about the hip hop guys in the city. And we were both in the same stages. And we were telling each other about stuff we'd heard. It was really amazing, you know, like we were telling each other the stuff that we had witnessed, because back then it was in a schoolyard or between the projects. Kids were doing it and talking about it. So I heard about hip hop and rap, like Africa Bombata and whoever, you know what I mean? They were talking about these people, and this was really amazing. Here's a picture of the Blessed. And I think this is Nick here, and he's the only one who's still alive. All these guys are gone. These three dudes I interviewed for the doc, for the project, they're all in the movie. And they've been documented. Wow, look at them. All gone, man. It's crazy. Max's Kansas City. So here's Howie talking about Max's Kansas City. I met a lot of people my age in the first 2 months when I left home. And then they all just made bands. We made a band. All those kids were not going out. We just met kids in the street. We were acting like we were home. We were just roaming the streets of the East Village all day and hanging out at Bleecker Bob's and going from here to there. I had that thing where I was reading Rock Scene and I wasn't old enough to go into the clubs. I was peeking in the window at Max's Kansas City. And when I go to the Palladium to see a concert and make friends, I'd walk a few blocks up the street to Max's so I could go look in the window of this place I had been reading about in Rock Scene. So I had this weird fantasy thing about it. When I finally decided I'm going in, which is also really weird because I decided I was going in, they let me in. It was the last thing that I had expected. I was just like, wow, this is weird. Nothing has ever come up to that feeling of walking into Max's the very first time. It was insane. It was really science fiction like. Really, it was the most unreal thing. I walked in and I felt like I had found it. Nobody feels this. People go their whole life without ever feeling this feeling. But I found it. I totally found it. And it was much more than I had expected. I was in ecstasy, real ecstasy. Like I was speechless. I don't know if anyone else ever really felt like what I'm saying, because what I'm trying to say is almost indescribable. I suddenly realized that everything that happened before didn't matter, and all the horrible things that had happened in my life were over, which wasn't true. But at that moment, I just felt perfect. This is exactly where I belong. What I've been looking for and dreaming of my whole life. Blondie was playing with the Cramps and Suicide. Oh, didn't mean to say that word. And Blondie had this whole girl group thing and all that stuff. Right. They were originally called like Angel or something. And he says, and Debbie Harry was always so and still is exactly the same. Totally sweet, not affected, you know. She always remembered my name and knew who I was and was really fucking nice and just so beautiful and talented and perfect. It's hard to believe someone like that existed. Blondie just had a weird magic about them. The Cramps were the Cramps. They were fucking fantastic. Lux and Ivy. And not realizing it at the time. But in retrospect, it's kind of funny how not cutting edge they were in a weird way. I mean, they were, of course, but they played all these 50s songs that I had collected as singles when I went to flea markets when I was a kid. And then they became Cramp songs. And then they started that whole rockabilly revival. Suicide, as insane as that thing was hair-raising and the loudest thing ever. But it's like rockabilly almost. The band was great and amazing and funny. They had a lot in common. Everyone had a lot in common, you know. What he's talking about, what he's describing when he talks about this stuff, he found community. He found community in a place where people were doing things that interested him, things that he found people that were doing the same things that interested him, basically, you know. And it goes to this adage, this very old adage of like create the fellowship that you crave, right? Like, or if it doesn't exist, or just go where your water level is at. That's ultimately what's being described here. So for a while, as we mentioned before, Howie Pyro worked at Manic Panic. On one of the days that I'd come out of work on Wall Street, I was walking down St. Mark's Place, and Trash and Vaudeville was open. So of course I had to go in there. And in the early punk days, there was only Trash and Vaudeville and The Late Show, which was just like old clothes, but they played cool music there. And we had heard that the New York Dolls used to rehearse in the basement and blah, 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 blah. So it was cool. And Frenchie worked there, and he was cool, and he knew the Dolls, and we liked him, and he was like a weird guy. Then next door is Trash and Vaudeville. And in the early punk days, they had the whole store, and the downstairs was a pinball arcade. So we'd go down there and hang out, and then we'd go upstairs, and the register back then was on the right side in the cubbyhole. So you had to leave your bags, but it's not there anymore. And now, you know, and now, I mean, Trash and Vaudeville lasted so long. What's his face? Jimmy Webb, who passed away, who knew everybody, kind of like the way Howie knew everybody. And, you know, Trash and Vaudeville really stayed on St. Mark's. They were one of the last things to go. And now it's just unrecognizable. Howie says here, and one day I was walking down the street and there was this new store just opening, literally just opening. And I wandered in there, and it was called Manic Panic, and they were putting a sign up. They had all this weird stuff in there, and I just wandered in there, and I was just standing in there, and I was like, this is so cool. You know what I mean? They were just really nice, and still are. Talking about Tish and Snooki. I wound up being their first employee, and that was the divining moment. Tish and Snooki were great people, really nice and sweet, you know. Besides everything else, once they gave me the job, I think I was paid $6 a day, but they let me sleep in the back, which was horribly scary. There were just all kinds of giant water bugs and stuff. I tried to make a line of chairs and sleep on the chairs. Just having a place to go and being paid $6 a day, which absolutely took care of my life's expenses, was great. And being in there, that's where the Dead Boys connection really originally came, because when they first moved to New York, that's where everyone went. Revenge wasn't even opening yet. There was nothing. And I believe Revenge, that's Natasha's store, or Natasha used to work at Revenge. I don't know. Yeah, I think she owned Revenge too. So I started the band The Blessed with Excessive and this guy Nick Berlin and Billy Stark. But we kicked Excessive out before we ever played, and he wound up in Richard Hell and the Voidoids. I don't know. We didn't get along. Teenage stuff. I don't remember what it was. We just didn't get along. None of us knew how to play except for him, actually. So they kicked out the one guy who actually knew how to play. We had tapes that don't exist anymore, which I wish they did. Nick's playing drums on a cardboard box and a hanger. It was like that. I was the oldest one. Nick was 3 years younger than me. Nick was 13. So Howie's 16 at this time. This girl, Eileen, lived upstairs from Manic Panic. That's Eileen Polk. And we would stay up there too. I learned a lot up there, not about SCX, but about music. She would leave us alone up there and let us stay there. So we'd go through her records. She had the 13th floor elevators and all this stuff. That's when I first heard the 13th floor elevators. And Nick knew about it because Nick grew up as a baby in Texas. Nick from The Blessed and his mother, that we were just watching his YouTube channel. They lived with the 13th floor elevators. Nick talked about them a lot, and I always thought that was weird. And Janis Joplin was his babysitter. You know, all this kind of crazy, crazy Austin shit. His mother was in the hog farm, and they moved to California and then to New York. Here's a picture of Howie nestled with a bottle and a furry vest on and weird striped pants. Great fashion sense. Really cool fashion sense.